What Apple is encountering today is almost exactly the same thing as what Microsoft encountered about 20 years ago in the 90s. Should Apple deserve 30%? Should they get $30 of that transaction? That's really what this comes down to. None of the App Store guidelines actually spell out this distinction between business and consumer. We're rejecting this app because there's a guideline, but it isn't written down, but it exists. Anytime you have Microsoft casting shade on your monopolistic tendencies, then, well, I mean, clearly they're biased, but you know there's something going on here. So you had an exec at Microsoft saying antitrust bodies need to review the Apple App Store. I mean, Microsoft clearly has not gotten over the fact that Apple beat them in phones when Microsoft had Windows Phone for years and years and years. Microsoft bought Nokia for like $7 billion, and I think that's almost a worthless investment now. Microsoft has a little bit of bias when this exec comes out and says, hey, regulators, come and look at Apple. But I think the interesting thing with this is, what Apple is encountering today is almost exactly the same thing as what Microsoft encountered about 20 years ago in the 90s. Literally almost exactly the same thing. And I think because of what Microsoft went through in the 90s, it basically set off a chain of events where they started to move away from or started to move more into enterprise businesses, right? Where they're selling to business customers as opposed to consumers. And really it was when they were selling to consumers. I mean, they still do sell to consumers. They bought LinkedIn recently, all these kinds of things. But it was their consumer businesses which were the target of these antitrust claims. Similarly here with Apple around the Apple App Store. So what really went on here? There's a huge outcry because the founders of Basecamp, which is another business tool for kind of like project management, right, was launching an email app called Hey. So this is the app as it exists today. It's Hey, and it's an email app. Pretty straightforward. They've got some features that are supposed to warrant the $100 annual price tag for the app. They submitted the app to Apple. It got approved. Then they were submitting some bug fixes and they were going to go kind of live with it, right? They kind of done a soft submission to the App Store, had been approved. They did some extra bug updates. That got rejected. And then this whole series of events went into effect. And basically, Apple rejected the app because they said its actual mistake was approving the app in the first place when it didn't conform to its guidelines. Apple allows these kinds of client apps where you can't sign up, only sign in for business services, but not consumer products. Okay, what does this mean? So you downloaded the Hey app. This was the original experience. You download the Hey app. It has you sign in. I believe there was a link to, this was the original V1 kind of screenshot of it, right? So you had to sign in. Otherwise, you couldn't do anything in the app. And I think like if you click this help me button, it would link you to hey.com where you could pay $100 membership to use the service, right? So basically the app was not functional unless you had an account. And if you didn't have an account and you downloaded the app off the App Store, there was a way to navigate to hey.com to hey.com without paying Apple their 30% fee, which is what they take on any in-app purchases. That's really what it comes down to. Is Apple saying, hey, if I bring you new customers, right? These are people that don't have a Hey account. They haven't already signed up for your service through your website. But right, if Apple's saying, if I bring you a new customer or a new user, and that user hasn't signed up for your service, and I help you, Hey, acquire a new customer, paying you $100 a year for an email app nonetheless, should Apple deserve 30%? Should they get $30 of that transaction? That's really what this comes down to. When you look at it through that lens, I'm actually kind of on Apple's side in the sense that if Apple is bringing me a user who's not an existing customer, and then I am now driving that user to sign up outside of using Apple's payment infrastructure, even though Apple brought me the user, doesn't Apple deserve some take of that transaction? I think it does. Now, here is where Apple gets into trouble, is they have double standards and they contradict themselves. So, basically their explanation here was that the Hey app should have never been approved in the first place. This guy Schiller is one of the top executives there. And he said, we want Hey to change the app so that it can be functional if you don't have an account, right? So what Hey has done, fast forward to today, they have allowed you to get a free email for 14 days as a trial program. And then I would imagine you can go sign up for a full account at hey.com, still circumventing Apple getting their 30%. I actually think this was the wrong resolution to it because, I think the point here is, are you allowed to link to hey.com to try to convert these users that aren't actual paying customers and turn them into paying customers? Can hey.com link to their site and deliberately circumvent the App Store process? That's actually not what changed here. What changed here is Apple saying, hey, we want you to give an experience to users if they don't have your account. We don't want like a zombie app or a non-functional app on the App Store. Where the irony is there are a bunch of business apps that, this is literally how it works. Basecamp included, these guys' original business, but think of Salesforce, right? Or any Microsoft apps, or many Microsoft apps, maybe not all Microsoft apps, but you download Salesforce, you can't use Salesforce unless you have an enterprise account. So what's Apple going to do? Ban Salesforce from the App Store? No. So now Apple's saying, hey, because you're a consumer app, not a business app, you're not allowed to do this. Now, the problem is none of the App Store guidelines actually spell out this distinction between business and consumer. So that's contradiction number one. They're kind of like making up these delineations on the fly. Although they sound reasonable on the surface level, none of this is even in their terms of service. That's a problem when you are a monopoly, which they are. They're really a duopoly with Apple and Google's Android. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is there are consumer apps that do have no experience unless you have an account. What would that be? Oh, like Netflix. So there are now Apple says there are reader apps. So now Apple is making another distinction of category of app, these reader apps, where if you don't have an account or if you haven't purchased an account already, the app is not functional. And Apple is not going to try and, force Netflix to, pay Apple 30% of a Netflix membership, right? So that's another contradiction. Contradiction number two. Anyway, this is a real, when you actually look at the brass tacks of the Hey case, I can understand where Apple is coming from. And I actually tend to agree with Apple. Where Apple's getting into hot water in this is their terms of service, their App Store guidelines don't delineate these kind of boundaries that they're talking about, which is a problem when you are a duopoly, when you have rejected many apps because you say, hey, you don't follow the guidelines, but now you're kind of saying, well, we're rejecting this app because there's a guideline, but it isn't written down, but it exists. So, where is the line? And that is really the crux of this. So long story short, Apple has come out and said, we are going to let developers challenge the App Store guidelines. Again, the irony in all of this is the guidelines didn't exist for the reason that Apple was kind of saying that they were rejecting this app. So again, this is kind of like a catch-22. It's like you can repeal or you can challenge the guidelines, but what if the thing isn't even in the guideline, already? I think this goes to one of the two key cruxes, one of the two key things of how producers and suppliers are taken advantage of by platforms. One of them is on the take rate. So, is the platform arbitrarily increasing the price, the take rate that it takes from the producer? Apple has kept it fixed at 30%. They have lowered it in certain other product categories, by the way, but generally it's 30%. They've stuck to that pricing model. Other platforms like Amazon, they fluctuate the take rate based upon product category, based upon season, like the holiday season. Uber, Lyft, they fluctuate the take rate from drivers. So that's probably the biggest grievance amongst producers. The second biggest grievance would be, hey, you penalized me. You kicked me off the platform. You didn't accept my app. I need a forum to, challenge this. How can I rebut this? And very often, if Apple rejects your app, there's no rebuttal process. There's no one you can go to. You can't call anyone up. These guys, hey.com, they got a little bit of special treatment because they have a following on Twitter, because they have had successes in the past. So they have a different level of access to Apple and to cause an outcry here. So anyway, now Apple is giving a little bit and saying, yes, we're going to allow developers to challenge these App Store guidelines, which is a step in the right direction. When it comes to these overarching questions around, hey, what is Apple allowed to charge for and try and take 30% for, or not take 30%, and so on and so forth. And now the EU has come out and said they're launching an investigation into Apple's App Store rules. Where the platforms get into trouble is when they vertically integrate and they are directly competing with their producers. You see this on Amazon competing with third-party sellers very aggressively. But you also do see Apple vertically integrate and compete with their developers as well. The EU complaint here specifically lists Spotify, right? Spotify versus Apple Music. Very clear battle on that front. We've seen this before in the ebook and audiobook category, kind of if you rewind the clock a number of years ago when Apple wasn't, say, as dominant in that space. But, if you think about the Kindle and Apple Books, and that rivalry there. So there are a lot of cases where the platforms vertically integrate and they get into trouble. And that's what Microsoft got in trouble for 20 plus years ago, was with the browser, bundling of Netscape versus Internet Explorer, and Microsoft favoring Internet Explorer on their operating system, Windows, and bundling that in versus now competing with, Netscape and other browsers unfairly. That vertical integration is where these platforms really get caught. Once you hit that monopoly scale, as Apple clearly has, you are naturally on the fringes going to have these blowups between developers being taken advantage of or having kind of these double or triple standards, and the platform kind of just shrugging it off until there's a blow up. And this blow up has now set off a chain of events, so we will see. Hi, this is Alex from Winner Take All. Thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed the content. Feel free to leave a comment, ask us questions, and definitely make sure to join us on our next live stream.